Welcome to the podcast supported by the Writing for Success grant, a 100% federally funded community projects grant of $385,000 to support literacy in the Milledgeville, Baldwin County community. I'm your host, Jess McQuain, project coordinator. Grab a snack and pull up a chair. I'm glad you're here. Welcome back to the Writing for Success podcast for another Writer Wednesday. On Writer Wednesday, we hear from writers and teachers of writing about their writing process, advice for young writers, and general discussion of what writing means to them.
Hello, listeners. My name is Lily Murphy, and today's Writer Wednesday is particularly special. During June of 2023, Milledgeville hosted its annual Juneteenth celebration. To commemorate the event, our student mentors went out and held a community podcasting session. We gathered a wide range of personal stories from around Milledgeville and beyond. So, without further ado, let's dive into the enriching conversations we had and discover how community podcasting can serve as a platform for amplifying a variety of voices and preserve the stories that define us. In this episode, we have freedom writer Joan Browning, who participated in the civil rights movement in 1961. She grew up in Telfair County, Georgia, before attending Georgia State College for Women. Her participation in the freedom rides took her to Atlanta, and now she lives in West Virginia. But we were honored to have her as a guest for Juneteenth. I had the chance to interview her, and I'm grateful to share our conversation with you all.
I am Joan C. Browning. I was a student at Georgia State College for Women from June 1959 to June 1961. When I was a student here, a very influential influence on me was Dr. Isabel Rogers. She was the YWCA director, and in that regard, she would have breakfast and dinners and invite people to speak to us. Dr. Izzy introduced me to things as a country girl I did not know about, like spaghetti and waffles and Flannery O'Connor.
You met Flannery O'Connor, correct?
Dr. Rosalie Walton was the head of the English department, and I took a couple of courses under her, and she also had Flannery O'Connor come to the classes. So I had two experiences with Flannery O'Connor. I went down in history, according to Dr. Sarah Gordon, because they knew that some student had asked Flannery O'Connor why she was a writer, and her response was a very haughty, "Because I'm good at it." And it turns out that was me, so I went down in history of Flannery O'Connor for asking her why she's a writer. And honestly, I thought to myself, no wonder you write about horrible people, you're not very pleasant either. I was here because I was good in math and science, and I got a scholarship to try to help beat the Russians in the space program. That math stood me in good stead. When I moved to West Virginia, I made my living as a freelance accountant bookkeeper. I had always wanted to write, though, and so when I paid off all my mortgages and all my debts and saved a little nest egg, I switched to a freelance writer. In doing that, being as compulsive as I am, I sat down and made a list of things I would do and things I would not do. And the thing I most wanted to do was to lift up people who didn't expect to be lifted up and show them as credible people doing wonderful things. And so that was my criteria for freelance writing, to write positive stories about people who normally would not be written about. One of the people in West Virginia that I wrote about long before she was famous was my homegirl, now I've missed her name, hidden figure, Catherine Coleman Johnson,
Really?
one of the hidden figures of the space program.
Yeah.
I knew her and her sister decades before she became famous.
Really?
And I had written about her. She was one of the people I wanted to lift up and be sure people knew about. So that's the sort of writing and storytelling I wanted to do, to tell stories like this young African-American who was deprived of a decent education in West Virginia, who went to be famous for her math skill. Of course, being a mathematician, I wanted to lift up mathematicians.
Yeah.
But it turns out now that we had two African-American women hidden figures in West Virginia, so now I'm writing about the two of them together to sort of compare and contrast. They both became part of the space program.
Could I ask real fast? You were talking about like you wanted to write to tell people stories, and I just wanted to ask, have you ever written any like stories more on the creative side?
I find real life stories so much more interesting than fiction. Um, my first publication was when I was in high school was fiction. It was in the Beta Club magazine, and it was about a dog. And they paid me $25, and I thought, wow, this writing is going to be a good thing. But I find true stories so much more interesting than fiction. I have written scripts. I have produced a number of documentaries about individual people, and I've written the scripts, and that's a kind of telling story, but telling it with film and interviews and photographs and things like that.
Yeah.
But I have to tell the story. It's a storytelling in a different way.
No, well, it's like you take like somebody's personal story, you're not changing it, you just kind of add what's already there, and you just kind of add like that visual so people can not just like, hear the story, but they can see it.
Well, and Julian Bond, when I first started talking about civil rights, said you have to use images because he said students now don't learn just through their ears, they learn through their eyes. And so he said anytime you can use images, it enhances what you're saying. And so I do a lot of PowerPoint. But even in the documentary, you have to tell a story. You accumulate so much more footage than you can use, and so you have to decide what is the story here. And I really am impressed with film as a way of really enhancing the story because then you can add music, and the music adds a whole nother emotional aspect to telling the story.
Yeah, it adds like a whole other tone. When I work, I used to think that script writing would be the thing that I want to do, but I ended up actually joining like my school's newscast, and I have found, similar to what you were saying before, that real life stories and finding people who like history might have like forgotten, bringing light to those stories is just so much more fulfilling, and just yeah, to me at least, that's what writing just seems it's so much more meaningful, I guess, to me that way.
Well, and the hardest life story I ever wrote was my own. And again, Julian Bond urged me to write because he said not many people know that white females, especially white Southern females, were part of the civil rights movement. And so I joined him up with my friends Connie Curry and Casey Hayden, and we published together with some other women. It's called Deep in Our Hearts, 9 White Women in the Freedom Movement. Each of us wrote about 40 or 50 pages about ourselves. Well, to get to the 40 or 50 pages, I probably wrote 500 pages because finding my story was the hardest story I ever had to find. I know too much. And so what matters to the people who are going to read this story? And it was good for me to practice on myself to be able to see what's important about other people's lives. And again, I never wanted to write about people who slipped on banana peels or who made mistakes. We all do that. What I wanted to do was make stories relevant to other people who might be experiencing similar things to these people. And I've written some stories I'm quite proud of, including about Miss Katherine Johnson.
That is like really interesting. Well, because like I know that there was like a movie, or like I'm not gonna call it a documentary because it fell more on the drama side. I'll guess historical drama. That did kind of bring light. I know like 3 of the women, and I'm sure that there's more. But it's like, again, very interesting to hear those stories and just to see that they do well as well, and like people are starting to finally open up and listen.
Well, and she was not unhappy. She understood the nature of Hollywood film, that they had to fudge a few facts. But I participated in a documentary about her. It's called Outlier, Outlier, and it's available on the West Virginia Public Television.
Okay.
And we got to interview her. And again, my theory is let people speak for themselves. And so she tells her story in her words. And so I'm very proud of having, and I didn't write the script. I just wrote some of the questions to ask her to be sure she would cover this or that. But by that time, she was good at telling her life story. And so, and sometimes that's a disadvantage because people get set in a certain way of telling. I wanted to get fresh insights. And so I Instead of writing the script, I wrote the questions.
Yeah. Like, and writing like interview questions, like that's like a whole other art form unto itself. Because it's like you don't want to put words into their mouths, but you want, it's more of like just kind of guiding. And well, especially sometimes when you're in an interview, it's like you have to think of something off the spot because they say something and it's like that's really interesting.
And I always write open-ended questions because I don't want to guide the answer. I just want to introduce this way of looking at yourself and what do you think about this?
Yeah.
And that is a challenge. That is hard writing because some people, as I say, have their stories written in stone and that's all they're ever going to say. That's frustrating.
It is a little bit because this was like sometimes, especially when it is writers or a life story piece, asking these questions and they'll say something and it's like, I read that in an article that I read about you. And that's again where like asking those questions and just trying to like dive in a little bit deeper.
It had worked for me to ask questions about childhood stories because those will not have been covered so well, and they will also be more precious. And so people will often give you insights into who they became by telling their childhood stories.
I see, yeah. But yeah, there's like just so many ways to go about it. Again, like writing like a success like, interview question, it's like a completely different mindset than writing for like fiction or writing for like a documentary or a script. It's an art form all onto itself.
Well, but I enjoyed it because it's not my opinion.
Yeah.
It's this person talking about themselves. And everybody, I think, is really the expert on themselves if they're honest.
Yes.
If they'll be honest, they're the expert. But if they're not, then I can go ask somebody else about them and get, do this triangulation. Ask 3 people and I'll find out what happened.
Yeah.
I have one other fact about Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah.
Dr. Robert E. Lee's only sister, Mariette Lee, came to live in my county in West Virginia.
Really?
I knew she was there, but I didn't have a pleasant interaction with Dr. Lee, and I didn't want to mess with that family. But a retired school teacher opened an independent bookseller, and I would go in and she would hand me a book and say, you should read this. And one of the books was the letters of Flannery O'Connor, and a number of them were to and from Mariette Lee. And so I did read those because they gave me more insight into Milledgeville that I had not stayed here long enough to experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even up there in the wilds of West Virginia, Flannery had an influence, but I still thought she wrote about unpleasant people, and she was unpleasant.
You had like mentioned like about hearing people's stories. Because that's like how I like to go about interviews, listening, because again, like that's like what makes the mass communication field for me so much fun, is just the fact that like I can just keep the camera rolling and just listen to people's stories. Yeah, always like keep the cameras rolling, you know.
I got into doing oral history. I'd studied the University of North Carolina's way of doing it, and then I actually presented papers at a couple of oral history meetings. When I started, the medium was cassettes, little cassettes. And so I would go and I would make appointments. I'd set up my recording and my notes and whatnot. And then I'd ask people if they would be willing to say their name and where we were and all of that. And then I'd do whatever we did. And I would say, well, thank you very much. But I wouldn't turn the tape recorder off because after they thought that I was not recording, I got really good stuff. And sometimes I wouldn't use it because it was too personal. But sometimes when I was transcribing, I would be in touch with them and say, do you remember saying such and so? Is it okay if I include that in the record? I would never include anything that they didn't want. Yeah. But once when they were on record, especially people who are not accustomed to being recorded and interviewed, they would be stiff and formal. When they thought the interview was over, they would relax and tell me good stuff.
Yeah. And when you make it more like a conversation and less like you're shoving like a camera or like a mic in the phone.
I would start putting my papers together and in folders and whatnot, and would look like as if the interview was concluded. But I would not use that without checking with them and getting permission.
Yeah, privacy and like that, it's always important. Always something to keep in mind.
And if in the structure of the interview, they had told me something that I wanted to be sure that they wanted made public, because the point of my interviews was that they would be made public.
Yeah.
I would check with them and say, you said this and this, is it okay that I include it? And sometimes they would say, oops, I didn't mean to tell you that. And I would delete it because it's their story, their voice, and it should only be used with their approval.
Yeah, of course.
And it's easier to get approval when you're lifting people up in positive ways.
Yes. There's like different situations, circumstances, like, you never know where somebody's coming from. Sometimes it's like, people have to, like, there's reasons why people don't want to talk or say things about themselves, and that should always be respected.
I did a number of interviews on tape recorder with elderly African Americans in my community. And there was a traumatic event. I would always ask, what was the scary thing that happened when you were a child? And every one of them named a particular lynching that happened when they were children. And one of them said, turn off the tape recorder and I'll tell you who some of the lynchers were. And he named some of the people who were in the lynch mob. But he did not want that on the record.
Okay.
And so I have hoarded that information. He's long gone on to glory, and I'm on the verge of it one day soon.
Yeah.
And I want that information to be public, and I think I'm just going to type it out and put it in my papers at Emory, and someday some enterprising scholar will look on it, because he trusted me with that information. He just didn't want it on the record.
Yeah, of course.
He was still afraid. They were all still afraid of these people. There were 40 white men who had been in the lynch mob, and they knew who they were, and they were still afraid. Even that was in 1926, and I was interviewing them in the 1990s. They were still afraid.
Yeah.
That's how long these traumatic things last.
Yeah.
Okay. You have room for other people.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this interview and just sitting here and talking with us.
To learn more about the Writing for Success podcast and grant project, please visit writingforsuccess.gcsu.edu. You can also find us on Facebook at Andalusia Institute GC, on Instagram at andalusiainstitute.gcsu, and on YouTube, Andalusia Institute GCSU.